Hello, I'm Tracy Borman and I'm delighted to be hosting this Elizabethans course. Elizabeth is my all-time favourite monarch. I keep coming back to her, so it's a joy to do so once again. And we're starting with a subject that's very close indeed to my heart, Elizabeth's court. Well, this is really where my love of history began, with the razzle-dazzle of the Elizabethan royal court. And I'd like to take you with me now into that court, both the public rooms and what went on behind closed doors. So buckle up and here we go. Well, the court of Elizabeth I was once described as being gay, decent and superb. Well, we probably know that the gay and the superb, it was one of the most opulent, spectacular courts in the whole of Europe. But what about that word decent? That was probably the most important word in that observation by a contemporary, because the point was this: Elizabeth was an unmarried monarch and an unmarried woman. So she had to be very, very careful of her reputation. So while her court may have seemed all frivolity and excess, it was all strictly controlled by the Virgin Queen herself. There was a very rigid etiquette from which nobody was allowed to stray, particularly the Queen herself. I personally do believe, by the way, she was genuinely the Virgin Queen. Let's just cover that one off very early on in this course. Well, the Elizabethan court was structured in very much the same way as the Tudor court in general, so that of her predecessors. And everything was symbolic. Now, if you just turned up to Elizabeth's court, you couldn't just wander into any room. Everything was ordered according to status and rank. So essentially, the closer you got to the heart of the court, which was the Queen's privy chamber, her private apartments, the higher ranking you must be. So somebody like me, I wouldn't have made it past the sort of outer courtyards. You really had to be one of the Queen's closest favourites or a visiting ambassador to be invited into that inner sanctum, the privy chamber. Well, Elizabeth hadn't invented this style of architecture. As I said, it had been around throughout the Tudor period, and it went back even further than that. The 1100s, we find references to a sort of private chamber for the king and queen. But it was Elizabeth's paternal great-grandfather, Edward IV, the father of the princes in the Tower, if you need that reference, I'm sure you don't, who had really established this system of keeping something back, I would say, from the rest of the court. He was the one who appreciated that in order to enhance the sort of mystique of the monarch, they needed their own private world in the centre of this very public world of the court. So he established this whole suite of rooms, which collectively became known as the Privy Chamber. Now, one of the first rooms as you entered the Privy Chamber was the Presence Chamber. So if you were lucky enough to be invited into the private world of Elizabeth I, this was probably the room you would have seen. And I'd like to share with you a lovely description by a visitor to Elizabeth's court. He was a Swiss tourist named Thomas Platter, and he was lucky enough to be invited there to the Presence Chamber. And he was so dazzled by it all that he wrote it down as soon as he came out. He said, "We were led into the Presence Chamber,
where we were placed well to the front, so as to better behold the Queen. This apartment, like the others leading to this one, was hung with fine tapestries, and the floor was strewn with straw or hay. Only where the Queen was to come were carpets laid down in Turkish knot. After we had waited here a while, some men with white staffs entered from an inner chamber, and after them a number of lords of high standing, followed by the queen very straight and erect, who sat down in the presence chamber upon a seat covered with red damask, and cushions embroidered in gold thread, and there was a canopy above, fixed very ornately to the ceiling.
So you really get a sense from this of the huge, elaborate ceremony surrounding the Queen at all times. You would have been in no doubt as to who you were about to meet. Well, when it came to her palaces, Elizabeth wasn't exactly like her father Henry VIII, who'd been a great builder of palaces. He built about 60 or more. Elizabeth's approach was more make, do and mend. She was very thrifty, like her grandfather Henry VII. So she inherited palaces, but she didn't really build many of her own, or indeed any. But she did like to embellish them. Well, one of her favourite palaces, probably her very top favourite, was Richmond Palace, west of London. Well, Elizabeth, like me, felt the cold. I'm perpetually cold. She was too. This is why she liked Richmond, because it was her warmest palace. She called it her warm box because it had a fairly sophisticated central heating system. And it had other modern conveniences. It had one of the first recorded water closets or toilets invented by her godson, Sir John Harrington, which carried the waste well away rather than just it falling into a pit beneath to be shovelled out by the gong scourers, as had been the case for many hundreds of years. And she loved to decorate her favourite palace. And one of my favourite descriptions of Richmond is a feature that she commissioned, which was a boat-shaped bed with curtains of seawater green and quilts and valance of light brown tinsel, I guess for the kind of sand or the seabed. So Elizabeth was quite fanciful in that respect. Well, further upriver was my stomping ground, Hampton Court, where I'm lucky enough to work for part of my week. And it was described as being the most splendid and magnificent royal palace of any that may be found in England. And here you really saw decadence. There were rooms decorated with diamonds, rubies, sapphires. Amongst Elizabeth's personal possessions in her private library was a walking stick made from a unicorn's horn, believe it or not, a receptacle for combs shaped like a man, and a horn cup that was reputed to break if it came into contact with poison. More palaces, more decadence. Whitehall, Elizabeth had a sort of steam bath, like a sauna really, quite sophisticated for its day. There were oyster shells from which water poured, and she even had an organ installed next to her bathroom so she could be serenaded whilst soaking in the tub. Most of Elizabeth's key palaces were accessed by river. And this is what I should say about the Tudor court, really. They built them very deliberately to be close to the River Thames, because this was like the motorway of its day. This is how people travelled. It was faster, safer, more comfortable than travelling by road. So the more important a palace, the more likely it is that it's sitting right by the River Thames. But of course, she didn't just stay in her own palaces. She was famed for going off on progress. And you can't really talk about the Elizabethan court without talking about Elizabethan progresses. Well, partly these progresses, these great journeys that Elizabeth made around her country, about every other summer, she did 23 progresses that we know of during the course of her long reign. Partly they were motivated by necessity. Because frankly, after the court, which could number up to 1,000 people, had been in residence in any one place for a given time, that place needed a rest. It needed to be fumigated, you might imagine. Bodies crammed up against each other, not exactly, modern conveniences. Elizabeth might have had her own flushing toilet. That wasn't the case for the rest of the court. And also, they'd exhausted the supplies. They ate locally, by the way, they ate seasonally. So they were kind of far ahead of where we are in a way, or where we're now getting to be. But that once they'd exhausted supplies, the court had to move on. So that was another driver for these progresses. But for Elizabeth, it was about PR. She wanted to show herself off to her people, to be seen by her people. So up to 1,000 people would accompany her as she made her way around the country. Now, I should say around the country with a qualification that she never went further west than Bristol or further north than Stafford. But she certainly made the most of them, made sure that she was seen by as many of her subjects as possible. And let's just say she didn't travel light. She would take with her, as well as those 1,000 courtiers, servants, cooks, apothecaries, 300 cartloads of goods. So furniture, clothes. Elizabeth liked to take even her beds with her. She was very fond of one particular bed. Apparently it gave her a good night's sleep, so she took that with her. So it was a huge logistical operation. And it was also a huge responsibility for those hosting the court, because they had to be able to afford it. They had to often build entire new wings or even castles to accommodate the Queen and her court. And it did bankrupt some courtiers. You actually didn't want to be selected to host the Queen. It might be a great honour, but it could also bankrupt you. Well, one courtier who perhaps spent more than anybody else in hosting the Queen was her greatest favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who in 1575 lay on a spectacular entertainment for the Queen and her court at his Warwickshire home, Kenilworth Castle. And the building works alone that he commissioned for this visit totalled £60,000, which is equivalent to about £12 million today. But he thought it was going to be money well spent. This was Dudley's last-ditch attempt to persuade Elizabeth to marry him. Sadly for him, it failed. One of the most famous was the Elizabethan adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh. He spent much of Elizabeth's reign going off on overseas voyages, discovering new lands, new worlds. He's often credited with founding Virginia, which he didn't actually do, but he did found or try to found some colonies in North America in the 1580s. It was only later, though, in the reign of Elizabeth's successor, that Virginia and other colonies were more firmly established. What he did, though, was to bring back a whole range of exotic plants, spices, back to the Elizabethan court. Not, by the way, the potato. He's often credited with that too, but that wasn't Raleigh. What he did bring back, though, was arguably more valuable because he brought back an awful lot of Spanish gold. He and his fellow adventurers would raid Spanish treasure ships and they would bring back the spoils to their queen. So he was seen as a hero of the Elizabethan era. Not so the Jacobean era. One of the first things Elizabeth's successor did upon taking the throne was to throw Raleigh into the Tower. He could not stand him, and I'm afraid that's where Raleigh spent the rest of his days. I'd like to just mention another courtier who is actually one of my favourites. He's Francis Bacon. Now, he's a bit of a polymath. He could do absolutely anything. He was a philosopher, statesman, lawyer. He actually wasn't that highly favoured by Elizabeth. She didn't give him any great promotions. He was her counsel, the first Queen's counsel in history, so her legal advisor. But it was only in the reign of James that he became Lord High Chancellor and the like. But he was a great scientist, and he was the one who really promoted the idea of observations for scientific discovery. And he is credited with one of my favourite quotes from the Elizabethan era, that I would not open windows into men's souls. Now, that usually is attributed to Elizabeth and talks about her religious stance, i.e., you must, in theory, believe as I believe, the official religion, Protestantism, but I'm not going to look into your soul. So privately you can believe what you like. But that was actually Francis Bacon. So I've mentioned those favourites. You will notice they are all men. And that's the last thing I would like to just mention about the Elizabethan court. It was a very male-dominated space. Women, frankly, weren't welcome. When it came to Elizabeth's court, there was only room for one queen bee in the hive.